Never let a human design your flagship. The old instructor did not raise his voice, but the words landed so hard that every cadet in the Galactic Shipwright Academy stopped typing. A room filled with the brightest engineering students from more than 40 civilizations suddenly went silent. Some exchanged amused looks. Others smirked. One young cadet near the back finally raised his hand. Is that an actual regulation, or just another story they tell first years? A few people laughed. The instructor did not. He slowly turned toward the massive holographic wall behind him, where hundreds of famous starships rotated in perfect formation. Sleek hulls, elegant curves, beautiful symmetry. Every vessel represented centuries of alien engineering tradition. Then, with one tap of his wrist console, every image disappeared. A single line of text replaced them. Human design participation prohibited under Galactic Naval Safety Act. The room grew quiet again. Wait, another student said. You actually banned an entire species from designing ships? Yes. Because they built dangerous weapons? The old instructor folded his hands behind his back and looked out the panoramic window toward the orbital construction yards floating above the blue gas giant below. No, he answered softly. Because they designed ships that made all of ours look irresponsible. Confused whispers spread through the lecture hall. That was not the answer anyone expected. Humanity was still considered one of the younger spacefaring civilizations. Their vessels looked bulky compared to the graceful alien cruisers displayed in museums across the galaxy. Human ships lacked artistic hull patterns, glowing energy fins, and polished ceremonial architecture. They were often described as oversized industrial equipment that somehow wandered into military service. One student could not help himself. How could ugly ships threaten galactic engineering? The instructor smiled for the first time all morning. That question has embarrassed entire governments. He walked slowly across the room until he reached an old display case covered with a cloth. Pulling it away revealed something surprisingly ordinary. It was not a weapon. It was not an advanced reactor core. It was a faded steel wrench with scratches worn into the handle from years of use. This belonged to Nathan Brooks, he said. Blank faces stared back at him. Nobody recognized the name. Exactly, the instructor continued. He was not an admiral. He was not a politician. He never commanded a fleet. He never won a famous battle. He fixed broken ships. More confused looks. You banned humans because of a mechanic? Someone asked. The instructor nodded. One mechanic who asked questions nobody else bothered to ask. He let the silence linger before speaking again. Every civilization believed starships should impress people. Nathan Brooks believed they should bring people home. The room was completely still now. Every screen in the academy automatically dimmed as archival clearance activated. A warning appeared across the wall. Restricted historical record. Authorized educational access only. Several cadets leaned forward without realizing it. Even the ones who had been laughing a minute earlier were suddenly paying attention. The instructor took a slow breath. You have all studied the collapse of the first Galactic Defense Fleet, he said. Your textbooks blame enemy tactics, software failures, and political mistakes. Those books are incomplete. They leave out one inconvenient detail. He looked directly at the class. The fleet did not fall because the enemy was stronger. It fell because one human engineer had already predicted exactly how every beautiful ship in that fleet would fail. Nathan Brooks never planned to change the galaxy. He was just trying to keep old ships flying one more day. 22 years before his name quietly disappeared from every public engineering record, he worked the overnight shift at the Norfolk Orbital Assembly Yard above Earth. His office was not really an office. It was a cramped maintenance room with 2 coffee makers, one that barely worked and another that nobody trusted. Every morning, he walked the same inspection route carrying a dented metal toolbox that looked older than some of the interns following him around the docks. Nathan was 42, white, broad-shouldered, and usually dressed in grease-stained coveralls instead of the polished uniforms favored by corporate engineers. He was the kind of man who listened more than he talked. If something rattled inside a ship, he wanted to hear it before anyone else did. One rainy Thursday, a shuttle from the Galactic Ship Design Bureau landed unexpectedly at the yard. The visitors stepped out wearing immaculate silver uniforms that somehow stayed perfectly clean despite the constant construction dust floating through the docking bays. Leading them was Director Celine Vorak, a respected engineer from one of the oldest civilizations in the Alliance. She watched human workers weld hull plates, replace damaged piping, and crawl through maintenance shafts with puzzled curiosity. None of it looked elegant. None of it looked efficient. Yet every ship scheduled to leave that week departed on time. "Which one is Brooks?" she asked. A supervisor pointed toward the far end of the dock where Nathan was lying on his back beneath a cargo transport, tightening a manual hydraulic fitting with an ordinary wrench. "That is him." Celine frowned. "That cannot be right." "Why not? Our records say he solved 3 reactor failures that our simulation teams could not explain." The supervisor shrugged. "He does not care much about records. He cares whether the ship makes it home." Nathan slid out from under the transport, wiped his hands with an old shop towel, and looked at the unexpected visitors. "Morning," he said casually. "Something broken?" Celine hesitated. She had expected confidence, maybe even arrogance. Instead, she found a tired mechanic who looked like he had skipped lunch because somebody else's problem mattered more. "Nathan Brooks?" she asked. "That is me. The Bureau would like to invite you to participate in the design review for the new Galactic flagship." Nathan blinked once. "You probably have the wrong guy." "We do not." He smiled politely. "Ma'am, I fix ships. I do not design them. That is exactly why we are here." Nathan looked around the busy maintenance bay before setting his wrench back into the toolbox. "If you want the prettiest ship in the galaxy, I cannot help you." Celine exchanged puzzled glances with the other delegates. "And if we want the safest?" Nathan answered without hesitation. "Then stop asking what looks impressive and start asking what happens at 3 o'clock in the morning when half the lights go out. Somebody is trapped behind a sealed hatch, and the only person who remembers the emergency procedures is the exhausted mechanic who has been awake for 20 hours. None of the visitors laughed. For the first time, they realized they were not speaking to a repair technician. They were speaking to someone who looked at starships the way firefighters looked at burning buildings, not as machines to admire, but as places where ordinary people might someday be trying to survive long enough to get back home. The Galactic Ship Design Bureau occupied an orbital complex so enormous that it had its own weather control system inside the main engineering dome. Sunlight filtered through transparent alloy panels nearly a mile overhead, illuminating dozens of full-scale ship sections suspended by magnetic cranes. Delegations from every major civilization crowded around holographic displays, each convinced their design philosophy represented the future of space travel. Nathan Brooks arrived carrying the same dented toolbox he had taken everywhere for the past 20 years. Several engineers glanced at it before quietly smiling to themselves. One whispered, just loudly enough to be heard, "Did someone invite maintenance by mistake?" Another replied, "Maybe they need somebody to tighten loose bolts after the real engineers finish." Nathan heard every word. He simply nodded politely and found an empty seat near the back of the conference room. Director Celine Vorik watched the exchange without interrupting. She wanted to see how the human would react under pressure. The presentation began with breathtaking holograms of the Alliance's newest flagship. The vessel stretched nearly 3,000 feet from bow to stern. Elegant curves blended seamlessly into shimmering shield arrays. Every hallway was perfectly symmetrical. Every compartment followed strict architectural harmony. Representatives applauded after each presentation as designers proudly explained advanced energy routing, adaptive artificial intelligence, and self-optimizing environmental systems. Nathan remained quiet, occasionally making small notes on a yellow legal pad instead of using the digital tablets placed in front of every delegate. After nearly 3 hours, the chairman looked toward him. "Mr. Brooks, Earth has remained unusually quiet. Would you care to comment?" Nathan looked up from his notes. "Sure." He stood, walked closer to the massive holographic model, and studied it for a long moment. "It is beautiful," he admitted. Smiles spread across the room. "Thank you," one designer replied proudly. Nathan nodded. "Can I ask a few questions?" "Of course." He pointed toward the center of the ship. "Where do your firefighters sleep?" The room became strangely quiet. One engineer frowned. "Excuse me." "The emergency response crew. Their quarters." Another designer answered with confidence. "Deck 42, adjacent to the environmental control hub." Nathan nodded again. How long would it take them to reach engineering if the central elevator network went offline? Nobody answered immediately. Someone finally responded, "Approximately 6 minutes using auxiliary access routes." Nathan looked genuinely surprised. 6 minutes. Within acceptable operational standards. He scribbled another note. Where are the manual pressure valves? Confused faces stared back at him. The automatic systems regulate pressure. I understand that, Nathan replied calmly. I asked where the manual ones are. Silence settled across the room again. One younger architect spoke carefully. There are no manual valves. They became obsolete generations ago. Nathan smiled politely, not because he thought they were wrong, but because he had heard that answer before. He continued, if the central computer crashes during a long-range mission, how does the crew isolate a damaged coolant loop? The lead systems engineer answered almost immediately. The computer will not crash. Nathan looked at him for several seconds before quietly asking, has every computer you have ever owned worked perfectly forever? A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Nathan walked around the hologram, studying the ship from every angle. You designed this assuming nothing important will ever fail, he said softly. I have spent my entire career assuming everything eventually will. Nobody laughed this time. For the first time that morning, the room stopped looking at the human mechanic as someone from a younger civilization. They started looking at him as someone asking questions they suddenly realized they could not answer. The meeting should have ended there. Instead, Director Celine Vorik surprised everyone by asking Nathan to submit an alternative proposal before the review board reached its final decision. A ripple of disbelief spread through the chamber. One senior architect actually laughed out loud. You cannot be serious, he said. We have spent 7 years refining this design. Celine remained calm. Then you should not be afraid to compare it with another one. Nathan looked around the room and shrugged. I will need a day. You have until tomorrow morning, Celine replied. Nathan did not spend the night creating artistic renderings or dramatic holographic presentations. Instead, he walked through the shipyard with a flashlight, talking to welders, electricians, maintenance crews, rescue specialists, and cargo operators finishing late shifts. He asked the same question over and over. What usually breaks first? Every answer went into a small spiral notebook already filled with years of observations. By sunrise, Nathan returned carrying a simple digital model. When the projection appeared above the conference table, several delegates looked genuinely offended. The ship was blocky. The hull lines were uneven. External maintenance access panels interrupted the smooth surface. Reinforced support beams were visible instead of hidden behind decorative plating. It looked less like a symbol of galactic prestige and more like a machine that expected to be used every day. It is practical, one designer said, struggling to find a polite word. Another was less diplomatic. It looks unfinished. Nathan smiled. No, it looks reparable. Someone pointed toward the oversized corridors running through the center of the ship. Why waste so much internal space? Nathan answered immediately. Because people carry equipment. Sometimes they carry injured friends. Sometimes they carry both at the same time. Another engineer highlighted the duplicate power conduits running along opposite sides of the vessel. Redundant wiring increases weight by nearly 9%. It also keeps life support running if one side fails. That failure is statistically insignificant. Nathan nodded. Statistics are comforting until you become the exception. More objections followed. Manual hatch releases. Mechanical backup pumps. Independent water reserves. Extra ventilation shafts. Storage lockers filled with ordinary hand tools. Every suggestion seemed old-fashioned compared to the sleek automation favored across the Alliance. One delegate finally crossed his arms. Your design assumes constant failure. That is an incredibly pessimistic philosophy. Nathan leaned against the table. No, it assumes people make mistakes. Machines wear out. Parts fail. Someone forgets a checklist. Somebody gets tired after a 16-hour shift. That is not pessimism. That is Tuesday. A few maintenance supervisors sitting quietly near the back exchanged knowing smiles. They had lived through enough long nights to understand exactly what he meant. Nathan enlarged the blueprint of Engineering Deck 7. See this wall, he asked. Yes. It comes out in 4 minutes with basic tools. The chief architect frowned. Why would anyone remove an internal structural wall? Because if someone is trapped on the other side and the door refuses to open, I do not care how beautiful the hallway looks. The room fell silent again. For the first time, the discussion was no longer about elegance or prestige. It was about the people who would someday trust their lives to a ship they had never helped design. Nathan quietly closed his notebook. "You are building monuments," he said. "I am building something a tired crew can still bring home on the worst day of their lives." Nobody had an answer for that. 3 weeks later, the Alliance approved construction of the first prototype using the original design instead of Nathan Brooks's proposal. The vote was not even close. Tradition won. Prestige won. Appearances won. Nathan accepted the decision without arguing. He packed his notebook, shook director Celine Vorik's hand, and prepared to return to Earth. Just before he reached the shuttle bay, Celine caught up with him. "You are leaving already?" she asked. Nathan smiled. "You hired me to give an opinion. I gave it." "You really believe the prototype will have problems?" "Every ship has problems." "You sound very certain." Nathan rested his toolbox on the floor. "I am not certain about what will fail. I am certain something eventually will." Celine studied him for a moment. "You do not seem disappointed. Being right has never fixed a broken ship." Before she could respond, alarms echoed across the orbital complex. They were not emergency alarms. They were engineering alerts. A test crew aboard the unfinished prototype had reported an unexpected systems interruption during a scheduled power transition. Nothing catastrophic had happened. Nobody had been hurt. Even so, the demonstration stopped immediately while engineers searched for the cause. The review board gathered inside the Mission Control Center overlooking the construction dock. Holographic displays showed every deck aboard the massive vessel. The chief systems engineer spoke confidently. The automatic recovery sequence should restore all affected subsystems within 30 seconds. 30 seconds passed. The displays remained unchanged. "Run the backup routine," another engineer suggested. "It is already running." A third specialist frowned at his console. "The backup cannot initialize because it is waiting for confirmation from the primary controller." Nathan quietly stood near the back of the room with his hands in his pockets. He said nothing. Engineers hurried from one terminal to another, proposing software patches, diagnostic scans, and remote resets. The discussions grew increasingly technical, but the displays in front of them barely changed. Finally, Celine looked toward Nathan. "Do you see something we do not?" He hesitated for a second. "May I ask one question?" "Go ahead. Can someone physically reach the equipment room that controls the primary network?" The chief engineer answered immediately. "Not until the central access doors unlock." Nathan nodded. "And what unlocks those doors?" Silence. Another engineer checked the schematic. "The primary network." Nathan looked around the room without the slightest trace of satisfaction. "Then your system is waiting for itself to save itself." Nobody spoke. He walked to the main hologram and pointed toward a narrow maintenance corridor hidden behind decorative structural panels. If this passage connected directly to the equipment room, a technician could already be inside with basic hand tools. One architect shook his head. That corridor was removed to improve structural symmetry. Nathan gave a small shrug. It was a beautiful decision. The room became painfully quiet. Celine slowly folded her arms as she looked from the elegant blueprint to Nathan's much simpler design resting on a nearby display. For the first time, she was no longer comparing engineering philosophies. She was comparing assumptions. One design assumed perfect systems. The other assumed ordinary people would someday face ordinary problems. And suddenly, that difference did not seem ordinary at all. Director Celine Vorik canceled Nathan's departure less than an hour later. Instead of boarding the shuttle back to Earth, he found himself standing inside Dock 12, where the Alliance kept an aging cargo cruiser that had been scheduled for retirement. The ship had none of the polished beauty of the new flagship. Paint had faded along the hull. Maintenance markings covered nearly every compartment. To most of the design board, it looked outdated. Nathan looked at it and smiled. "She has good bones," he said quietly. One of the younger architects frowned. "This ship is almost 40 years old." Nathan nodded. "Exactly. Let me show you why it is still flying." The group followed him through the main airlock. There were no glowing decorative corridors or seamless walls. Pipes were labeled in plain language. Electrical panels were easy to reach. Every important system carried large printed instructions beside it. One delegate looked almost offended. "Surely the crew does not need labels everywhere." Nathan stopped beside a valve with a bright red handle. "Maybe not on a normal day." He looked at the group. "Now imagine it is 3 in the morning. The ship has been shaking for 2 hours. Half the crew has not slept. Someone who has only been aboard for 6 weeks suddenly has to stop a coolant leak before breakfast. Would you rather trust memory or a sign that says exactly what to do? Nobody answered. Nathan continued walking. He opened a storage compartment. Inside were ordinary hand tools secured in foam inserts. Wrenches, flashlights, manual pressure gauges, spare cables. Every hallway has one of these, he explained. Why? Asked another engineer. Because emergencies never happen where you expect them. They reached engineering, where the chief maintenance technician, a cheerful woman named Lisa Monroe, greeted Nathan with a grin. You brought visitors? She asked, trying to convince them that ugly ships have feelings. Lisa laughed. Good luck with that. Nathan pointed toward the massive reactor housing. Lisa, humor me. She nodded. Without warning, she shut down one of the auxiliary monitoring consoles. A few indicator lights went dark. Nothing dramatic happened. She walked to a nearby cabinet, pulled out a laminated checklist, and handed it to one of the alien architects. Your turn. The confused engineer looked at the instructions. You want me to restart the console? Exactly, Nathan said. Pretend nobody here knows the system except you. The architect carefully followed each step. Within 2 minutes, the console was operating again. Nathan folded his arms. Now imagine you are on the newest flagship. The instructions exist only inside the computer that just stopped responding. The realization spread slowly across every face in the room. They had spent decades designing machines that assumed perfect conditions. Nathan had spent decades preparing for imperfect people having imperfect days. As the tour ended, Celine remained behind while the others quietly walked toward the shuttle. She looked around the aging engine room one last time. I finally understand, she said softly. Nathan tilted his head. Understand what? She smiled with a mixture of admiration and concern. You never designed ships around technology. Nathan picked up his worn toolbox and headed toward the exit. No, he replied. I designed them around the people who would still be inside when the technology let them down. The real test came sooner than anyone expected. Only 6 days after the design review, the Alliance Defense Fleet launched a large-scale readiness exercise near the edge of the Perseus corridor. It was supposed to be routine. 3 newly commissioned cruisers would operate alongside several older support vessels, including the same cargo cruiser Nathan had toured with the review board. Director Celine Vorick insisted that Nathan observe from the command center. You have earned at least that much, she told him. Nathan stood quietly near the back wall with a cup of coffee in one hand and his old notebook tucked under the other arm. I hope everything works, he said honestly. So do I. At first, the exercise unfolded exactly as planned. Ships executed precise formation changes. Navigation systems synchronized perfectly. Automated logistics moved supplies between vessels with flawless timing. Several members of the design board exchanged satisfied smiles. One engineer leaned toward Nathan. Still think we worry too much about failures? Nathan looked at the tactical display instead of answering. A few minutes later, one small warning icon blinked yellow on the operations screen. It was hardly noticeable. A communications relay aboard one of the newest cruisers had stopped responding after a routine software update. Automatic recovery will handle it, an officer announced confidently. 30 seconds later, another yellow icon appeared. Then another. The relay itself was never the problem. The recovery sequence had quietly overloaded 2 unrelated subsystems that depended on the same control network. Nothing dangerous happened, but confusion spread through the bridge crews. Different departments received different status reports. Engineers requested confirmation from computers that were still trying to confirm one another. That cannot be right, one systems analyst whispered. Nathan finally set down his coffee. It is happening exactly the way I expected. Celine looked toward him. How? Nathan walked to the tactical display and pointed at the support vessel traveling several thousand yards behind the formation. Watch that old cargo cruiser. Unlike the newer ships, its communications officer simply picked up a dedicated emergency handset connected through an entirely separate hardwired circuit. Engineers manually isolated the affected relay without interrupting navigation. Crew members opened local access panels instead of waiting for central authorization. Within minutes, the older vessel reported every department fully operational. Meanwhile, the advanced cruisers were still trying to untangle layers of automated processes designed to eliminate human intervention. The old ship solved the problem first, one architect said quietly. Nathan nodded, because nobody on board expected the computer to solve it for them. Another engineer stared at the display in disbelief. The newer ships have far more advanced technology. They do, Nathan replied. Technology is wonderful. Dependency is expensive. The command center fell silent as the exercise continued. Eventually, every cruiser recovered, and the mission concluded successfully. Officially, the fleet had passed every required performance standard. Unofficially, everyone inside that room knew they had witnessed something far more important than a successful drill. They had watched two completely different philosophies collide. One trusted flawless systems. The other trusted ordinary people who had been given the tools and freedom to solve problems when those systems inevitably fell short. Celine folded her arms as she looked across the room at the engineers who had dismissed Nathan only days before. None of them were smiling anymore. For the first time, they were no longer asking whether the human mechanics' ideas were practical. They were beginning to wonder how many generations of ship design had been built on the wrong assumptions. The emergency exercise ended without headlines, but the conversations that followed quietly spread through every major shipyard in the Alliance. Engineers who had laughed at Nathan Brooks only days earlier were now requesting copies of his notes. Maintenance chiefs began asking uncomfortable questions during design meetings. Rescue teams submitted reports that sounded strangely familiar. Every document pointed toward the same conclusion. Ships were becoming smarter, but crews were becoming more dependent. A week later, the Galactic Engineering Oversight Committee assembled behind closed doors. No reporters were allowed inside. No public transcript would ever be released. Around the enormous circular table sat admirals, shipbuilders, economists, and representatives from nearly every member civilization. Director Celine Vorik opened the session with a simple statement. We are not here to discuss one mechanic. We are here to discuss whether our entire philosophy has been wrong. The room remained silent. The chairman activated a wall-sized display comparing Nathan's proposal against the Alliance flagship. The differences no longer looked cosmetic. Every highlighted change represented another layer of independence from automation. Manual overrides, redundant plumbing, mechanical backups, larger maintenance corridors, clearly labeled emergency stations, additional storage for basic tools. One council member frowned. If we adopt these principles, construction costs increase by almost 12%. Another quickly added, fuel efficiency also drops. Before anyone else could respond, the chief rescue coordinator cleared his throat. Our records show crews complete emergency repairs nearly 40% faster on older human-built support vessels. Another official spoke next. Insurance providers estimate long-term losses actually decrease. The discussion continued for hours. Every argument against Nathan's approach eventually collided with real operational data. Finally, an elderly admiral leaned forward. We have spent centuries asking how to build perfect ships, he said quietly. Perhaps we should have been asking how to build forgiving ones. Nobody answered immediately. Celine looked toward the empty chair reserved for Nathan. He had declined the invitation, choosing instead to return to Norfolk Orbital Assembly Yard. He believed meetings rarely repaired anything. The chairman eventually broke the silence. Suppose every civilization adopts these methods. What happens then? A representative from the Commercial Shipbuilders Guild answered before anyone else could. Every certification standard changes. Another added, every manufacturing contract changes. A third spoke more cautiously. Every academy in the galaxy rewrites its engineering curriculum. The room slowly recognized the true scale of the problem. Nathan had not invented miraculous technology. He had challenged assumptions that entire industries depended upon. One council member finally voiced the thought everyone had been avoiding. This is no longer about engineering. The chairman nodded. No, it is about influence. If human design principles became the new standard, generations of celebrated architects would be remembered as the people who built beautiful ships that were difficult to repair under pressure. Entire economies built around elegance and automation would need to reinvent themselves. The silence felt heavier than any debate that day. At last the chairman closed the last report and looked around the chamber. We cannot allow uncontrolled adoption until we fully understand every consequence. No one celebrated the decision. No one applauded. They all understood that history had quietly shifted direction because one ordinary mechanic kept asking questions that nobody else thought were worth asking. Nathan Brooks never attended the meeting where the final decision was made. While officials debated regulations inside polished chambers hundreds of miles above the nearest planet, he was back at Norfolk Orbital Assembly Yard replacing a worn coolant pump on an aging transport that had already logged more than 8 million miles. He was exactly where he wanted to be. Around noon, his supervisor walked into the maintenance bay carrying a sealed government envelope. "Nathan, this came from the Alliance Council." Nathan wiped his hands on an old shop towel before opening it. The letter was surprisingly short. Effective immediately, all human personnel were prohibited from leading or approving the primary design of any Galactic-class starship until further notice. No explanation. No congratulations. No accusation. Just a signature and an official seal. His supervisor stared at him. "Are you going to appeal it?" Nathan folded the letter, slipped it into his toolbox, and reached for his wrench. "No, they just told you that you cannot design ships anymore." Nathan smiled faintly. "I was never trying to design theirs." The supervisor looked confused. "Then what were you trying to do?" Nathan tightened the last bolt before answering. "Remind them that somebody has to make it home." Months passed. Publicly, nothing seemed to change. The official regulations remained in place, and every academy taught that the restriction existed to preserve engineering consistency across the Alliance. But quietly, something else began happening. Maintenance crews started finding extra tool lockers installed aboard new vessels. Emergency maps became easier to read. Mechanical backup systems quietly returned to blueprints. Hallways grew a little wider. Manual release handles appeared where there had once been only electronic controls. Nobody admitted where the ideas came from. They simply appeared, one practical improvement at a time. Years later, Director Celine Vorik visited Earth for a routine inspection. She found Nathan exactly as she remembered him, kneeling beside another old cargo ship with a flashlight balanced on one shoulder. "You know," she said with a smile, "they still pretend none of this was your idea." Nathan chuckled without looking up. "That is fine. Does it not bother you?" He shook his head. "Ships do not care who gets credit. Neither do the people who make it back to their families." Celine stood quietly for a long moment. "The Academy teaches your story now," she admitted. "Not officially. Just the instructors who know the truth." Nathan finally stood, closed his toolbox, and looked across the busy shipyard where welders, electricians, apprentices, and mechanics worked side by side. "Tell them something for me." "What?" "Tell them that engineering is not about proving how smart you are. It is about making sure someone else gets another tomorrow." Decades later, the old instructor finished telling the story to his silent classroom. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody questioned the strange regulation displayed across the academy wall. One young cadet slowly raised a hand. "Professor, if they copied so many of his ideas, why did they never remove the ban?" The old instructor looked through the classroom window at dozens of starships under construction before answering. "Because some civilizations feared human engineering." He paused, then smiled gently. "The wiser ones feared becoming the kind of engineers who forgot why ships are built in the first place." The regulation was never really about keeping humans away from starships. It was a reminder that the most dangerous idea in the galaxy was not stronger technology. It was the simple belief that every person aboard mattered enough to plan for their worst day before it ever arrived.